Hello and welcome to my cramped kitchen. And today I'm pretty excited because we're going to be making some appetizers, canapes to be exact. And this recipe will be for people who are on a budget since we are going to use store-bought loaf bread. To start off, we'll take 4 slices of bread. You can use more if you want, but make sure you take pairs of slices. We roll up our sleeves and make sure our hands are clean before we start cutting off the crust of every slice. You may also notice that I'm using a normal knife to cut off the crusts. I want my canapes to be sharply cut, unlike using a bread knife where you get crumbs everywhere. And the cuts can get pretty rough. The downside to using a normal knife though is that it's easier to squeeze the bread and deform it later on in another slicing process, compared to using a bread knife which has a serrated edge, lessening the need to push the knife down, especially since canape bread is pretty delicate. I'll be going with the normal knife because as of filming this video, the bread knife is nowhere to be found. And don't even ask me why. Next up, we'll be needing some pickles. I bought a jar of mixed pickles because mixed pickles are, well, the name already says so. Mixed pickles contain pickles from different types, time, and flavor. I'm a fan of mystery, so I prefer my pickles being quite random, but not too much. And hold up, just give me a minute. Right, there we go. Get a good whiff of the contents of the jar and oh wow, that smells pretty sour. Appetizing for me, not gonna lie. I'll be using a toothpick to take out some of the pieces, since this newly opened jar is overflowing with brine. Put your pickles on a small dish or a cutting board if the pieces are too big. And as you can see here, our pickles are pretty thick. Some people prefer this, some people don't. Personally, I don't, because the canapes are gonna get really sour if there's too much pickle content. Another reason is because the ingredients that I was able to gather weren't exactly the best, so I'll have to adjust the portions to compensate for said recipe change. The pickles are pretty crunchy, so slicing them was pretty satisfying. Next, we hop onto our tomatoes. I couldn't really find any cherry tomatoes near my area, so I had to make do with the smallest tomatoes that I could find. Although this wasn't a pretty big deal to me since cherry tomatoes have this sweet tart taste, while I prefer sour flavors. So I was okay with using these tomatoes instead of cherry tomatoes, but it's up to you if you want to use cherry tomatoes. We'll slice the tomatoes straight down the middle and repeat for every other tomato. Although in my case, since these tomatoes were still pretty big, I sliced it a second time just so that tomato sizes were correct. You may also notice that I'm being pretty careful with the tomatoes since my knife isn't really the sharpest. But hey, at least we can make food with it. So now we're gonna have to rinse and pat our chopping board and knife dry, since we're done with the acidic or sour ingredients and we don't want any cross-contamination. And don't hold the knife like I did just now. It's a pretty dangerous way to hold a knife, plus it makes me look cool and intimidating. Next, we start by picking the best stems of parsley that we have on our hands, and making sure to slice the leaves off the stems carefully. We don't want to crush the leaves just yet. Now, you can dice the parsley if you want. I personally don't want to dice the parsley because I want to preserve as much of the flavor and aroma from the parsley as much as I can, and you'll see why in just a bit. So now we're going to take a block of room temperature butter and slice it. We plop the contents into a mixing bowl. Taking the parsley we just previously sliced, we mix it into the butter and let the flavors get to know each other. I use a fork to mix it all together just so that the parsley gets crushed into the butter. I also like to press the parsley down when mixing it around to really pound the flavors into the butter. You can add salt if you want, but I personally like unsalted butter. So it's really all about personal preference here. You can add more parsley if needed, but make sure to pound them into the butter finely as well. Once the butter starts smelling very minty, you can set it aside. Once again, we clean our knife because a knife slathered in butter isn't exactly a good thing. Now we hop onto our olives. You can use black olives if you want, but I bought green olives just because I think the flavor of green olives are more fitting in canapes. Oh wow, that smells like wine. Really hard wine. We put the olives in a small dish just so that our ingredients are organized. Now we go back to our bread slices. We lay 2 slices side by side on the chopping board and give me a sec. I'll be using a spoon to apply the butter, because using a spoon lets me push the butter down into every nook and cranny on the surface of the bread. We take a generous amount, plop it onto the bread, and spread it out evenly. You can adjust the amount of butter that you want inside your canapes, but personally, I'm a fan of butter, so I'm just gonna apply a generous amount. Now, this is the step where you have to get creative. Now, I have a toaster oven, so we'll be using that to toast our bread slightly. And what I mean by slightly toasted is that it's not really toasted, but it's toasted enough that the bread becomes stiff. Pop it into our toaster oven, and now we just wait for our toaster oven to do its thing. And while we wait, we just jump around and, do whatever. So just sit tight for a while. Hey, have you been drinking water? Yeah, you gotta stay hydrated. Go and drink some water while we wait. Once the toaster oven has done its thing, we take the tray out and take a look at that bread, and okay, it almost slipped. We transfer the 2 pieces of bread back onto our chopping board, making sure they're lined up, and make sure to not burn yourself while holding the tray. And now we go back to our other 2 pieces of bread and we lay them on top of each slice. Now we're going to slice all of our bread into 4 pieces each. So if you have a bigger chopping board than me, you won't really have a problem, but as you can see, I'm having a bit of a space problem, so let me just deal with this real quick. Now, what I mean by slicing it into 4 pieces each is basically take 1 pair of our bread and we slice it in half, and once again slice the slices in half. Yeah, you'll figure it out. You may already figure out what I'm doing by just watching this video. Now, this is the problem that I mentioned earlier. The slices might get deformed because we're not using a bread knife, but you can always just fix that by pressing it down. So now we have 8 bases for our canapes. So now we're gonna start plating the actual canapes. So first we take our pickles and lay them on top of our bread. We're doing pickles first because pickles are flat and we want a flat base for our canapes just so that our ingredients don't slide around. So we just lay a pickle on each canapé, and next we go on to our tomatoes. We simply place the tomatoes on top of our pickles, and that's about it. For the last step, yeah, pretend you didn't see that. So for our last step, we're gonna be taking an olive and a toothpick, skewering the entire thing down its length, and take a look at that. That's 1 canapé complete. Now we just do the same thing for every other canapé. Now you might run into an issue wherein the bottom bread slides off. What you can do is lift the canapé up and carefully feel the toothpick pierce through the whole canapé. Now this may sound dangerous, but if you do this carefully, you won't really end up with a puncture wound on your finger. Now we just do the same thing for every other canapé as we finish it. And now here is our plated canapes. Now I have here my dad to taste test our canapes. And to eat canapes, you just take it by the toothpick and eat the whole thing in one bite. Well, it seems like that approves. And so there you go. You can now celebrate and enjoy by jumping around or doing whatever you want. Just celebrate. You did a great job. Now just don't mind me as I take one canape and dig in. And that was really good. Well, yeah, that tastes real nice. I'll be seeing you guys again in the next video. This video is actually a school project, so if you like what you see, well, maybe expect more. Well, if you like what you saw, well, maybe you should consider subscribing.